Dungeons & Dragons has a lot of rules, but not only that, it's got a lot of weird rules. Rules that don't really make sense and kind of defy logic and actually make gameplay feel a little bit more confusing and clunkier than it needs to be, and bog down play with the need to refer back to the player's handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide to resolve questions that should be fairly simple to answer in the moment. And yeah, of course, everything can always be house ruled by the DM, and homebrew rules do apply to some degree at least at nearly every table. But obviously, the point of this video isn't to be about that, or to be a referendum on whether you use house rules or the book as written or some kind of in between. The point is to talk about some very strange, unintuitive rules that I would love to see adjusted in the final printed versions of One D&D, D&D 24, or just 5e or whatever it is that we're calling it this week. No, none of these rules are really game-breaking, but they are still just gripes that and I'm sure many others have had with the game for a long time, and ones that, if tweaked correctly, I feel can make some meaningful impact on the quality of life for players. So let's get started. First up is one that I've actually spoken about before, and it's a little bit weird since in the early playtests, the design team actually did propose a change to nearly universal fanfare, but the change has apparently been walked back. I'm of course referring to exhaustion. As written in 5th edition, exhaustion was unquestionably one of the most potentially impactful, but massively underutilized sets of rules in the game. As I said in one of my previous videos, it's hard to not feel like exhaustion fell victim to its own design. It was created in such a way to be so threatening and to serve as a true consequence for pushing your character beyond their limits, to the point that it literally ends in death, that actually incorporating more than a few very niche uses for it would have undoubtedly led to a ridiculous amount of unnecessary character deaths. By far, the way that most people will have interacted with the exhaustion system was through the path of the Berserker Barbarian, and even there, it was so punishing that it was often cited as the biggest downfall of the class. To put it mildly, exhaustion was too punishing, and worse than that, far too complicated. I'll prove it. Pause this video and try and list all 5 stages of the exhausted condition. I'll wait. Alright. I actually use exhaustion fairly regularly at my table since I guess we're a bunch of masochists in my group, and even I don't know them offhand. Also, there are 6 stages. I'm not sure most people even caught that. I'm currently on track to reach 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I'm getting really close to 4,000 as well. The support has been overwhelming over the last few weeks, so if you'd like to help me reach some new milestones, a sub to the channel would be incredibly appreciated. Thank you so much. In any case, way back in the Expert Classes UA, the team presented a revised version of the condition, which was just so much more elegant in its design, even if it still does ultimately end with death. In the revised version, each level of exhaustion would contribute to a cumulative -1 to any d20 test that you make, including from your spell save DC. This makes for an effect that has some immediate impact without crippling a player. It also would have allowed for exhaustion to be used in so many more places as a potential consequence, hopefully without overdoing it though. However, when UA5 came around, the revised version of the condition was removed, and with no substitute left in place, we have to assume that it's just reverting back to its 2014 version, which is such a shame. I'm still holding out for some reworks to the system though. Now, let's talk about underwater combat and, by extension, holding your breath. Firstly, the rules for holding your breath are so ridiculous that they're mostly inconsequential. As per the suffocating section in Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook, you can hold your breath for an amount of minutes equal to 1 plus your Constitution modifier. So we're looking at a minimum of 1 minute, but realistically, no one has a con mod of 0, so even just a +1 gives you 2 minutes to hold your breath, which is still an absurdly long amount of time. But once you run out of air, it's still not done though. You can still survive for an amount of rounds equal to your Constitution modifier to a minimum of 1 additional round. Obviously, outside of combat, this isn't that insane, but in combat, it's basically forever. If you were in combat, even with a measly +1 Constitution modifier, and did nothing but hold your breath until you died, you could still survive for 22 rounds. There's also very minimal guidance provided for underwater combat in the Player's Handbook, and the DMG is also largely silent on the topic too, and the rules that do exist, despite how few, still almost certainly will require you to look them up. Melee weapon attacks are made at disadvantage, unless of course you have a swimming speed, or if the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident. There's a 0% chance that I will remember that, and I literally just said it. Ranged attacks automatically miss beyond their short range, and even have disadvantage within that short range, unless of course that weapon is a crossbow or a net, or is thrown like a javelin, spear, trident, or dart. It's wild. I've committed large portions of the player's handbook to memory, and this tiny 135 word section is something that I don't think I will ever fully remember. Maybe I would if they included some more useful instructions. Like, how does attacking not consume extra air? How does casting spells work? Jeremy Crawford suggested in a tweet that incanting the verbal component of a spell expels all of your air, but no one should have to look at tweets to play the game properly. Can we please just get some more clarity on this? The next one isn't nearly as egregious as the previous two, but I still just find it so confoundingly silly that I would like to see a change. The faster your character, the longer it takes to stand up. Chapter 9 of the PHB under Being Prone explains that getting up from being prone requires an amount of movement equal to half of your speed. This means that if your speed is 30, getting up costs 15 feet of movement, but if your speed was something higher, like 40, getting up now costs 20 feet. While easy to remember, it's just kinda dumb and you lose some of the benefit for being quick and agile. My suggestion would honestly be to leave the rule as is, in effect requiring an amount of movement still equal to half of your speed, but cap it at 15 feet. This prevents some weird scenario where if they just always made it cost a flat 15 feet or something, you wouldn't be able to ever stand if your speed was reduced to, let's say, 10 or 20. Like I said, this isn't really a big deal, it's always just been so weird and kind of annoyed me. Next up is probably going to be somewhat controversial, but it has to be the whole bonus action spell rule. This rule is so often misquoted and misinterpreted. Here's the actual text from chapter 10 of the player's handbook under the casting time section. Bonus action. A spell cast as a bonus action is especially swift. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast the spell, provided that you haven't already taken a bonus action this turn. You can't cast another spell during the same turn except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. This text is convoluted and difficult to parse to say the least, which has led to so much of the confusion about the rule. For clarity, the last line is really the most important part, and all it's saying is that if you cast a bonus action spell, the only type of spell that you can cast for the rest of your turn is a cantrip that has a casting time of 1 action. This is true whether the bonus action spell you cast was also a cantrip or not. Many people assume it to be that you can't cast 2 leveled spells on the same turn, but this is untrue, as casting something like Counterspell as a reaction on your turn doesn't prevent you from casting a spell with a casting time of an action. You can also accomplish this through the use of Action Surge. There's another weird interaction in that if you cast a bonus action cantrip, the only other spell that you can cast on your turn is another cantrip, provided that it is an action. However, if you cast a bonus action leveled spell, you can also still only cast the cantrip, but this interaction gets even weirder. If you cast something like Misty Step as your bonus action and the enemy decides to counterspell it for whatever reason, you are actually unable to counter their counterspell since you cast a leveled spell as your bonus action, therefore meaning the only spells that you can now cast are cantrips that have a casting time of 1 action, and counterspell costs 1 reaction, so it's out. But for whatever reason, you can totally counter a counterspell to your fireball or something. It's just so damn awkward. The rules are so complicated and convoluted and don't provide anything of value to the game through remembering the weird way that they work. Jeremy Crawford even said in one of the early survey videos that they want to ensure that if players need to remember some really specific rules interaction, that there should be a genuine reason or value for doing so. As written, this gives none of that. It's just weirdly complicated. In a really roundabout way, despite not even actually achieving it, it kind of just feels like they wanted you to not be able to cast 2 leveled spells in the same turn. I really just feel like they should just make that the rule. Yeah, it's a potential nerf in certain situations, I get it, but I just feel like the simplicity of that rule so far dramatically outweighs the complication and confusion of the status quo that it more than justifies it. The final bizarre rules interaction that I hope gets a revisit is essentially just how darkness or obscured vision and combat kind of interact. This reality is largely brought about by the fact that advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out, and because they don't stack either. If you're in a dark room shooting at someone on the other side and can't see them, you have disadvantage on the attack. However, since they also can't see you, you now have advantage, which results in it getting cancelled out, so it just becomes a straight roll. In a very strange way, it actually kinda makes sense if you consider things like how armor class and your ability to hit to be much more dynamic than simply attacking a stationary target dummy. Let me explain. So think about it this way. You're in a dark room, so you can't necessarily see the creature, but you probably still have a reasonable idea of where they are through sound, smell, or just your general awareness and perception. This represents your disadvantage. But similarly, they aren't able to spot the arrow flying at them and potentially dodge out of the way, get their shield up, or get just the right part of armor in the way. This represents your advantage. These two effects stack together to make it a straight roll. I'm not saying that it's without issue, but this is the logic that we're working with, and honestly, I can get behind this to some degree. Where it becomes problematic, to me at least, is the potential for manipulating the situation through interactions which just kind of seem absurd. Say your enemy is in the dark, but you aren't. You now have disadvantage on the attack roll against them, but since they can see you, you don't get advantage. But if you or a party member then cast something like a fog cloud on you, now that you can't see anything, you actually have a better chance at hitting your target. It's ridiculous. It still quote unquote makes sense by the same logic as above, but it's just crazy that manipulating game mechanics in this way can allow for such things to actually work. I don't really know what the elegant solution is to something like this. I don't think removing the cancellation of advantage and disadvantage is actually a good idea, since it is really an elegant solution to so many other issues, and I don't want to be sitting there counting sources of advantage and disadvantage throughout my sessions. Honestly, that sounds worse than casting Fog Cloud to be able to get a better shot at your target. Lastly, I just want to give some credit where it's due and recognize the design team for fixing a few of the other really weird rules interactions. Firstly, they've actually fixed the way that blindsight and invisibility interact. Previously, if you had the invisible condition through whatever means, you would have advantage on attack rolls against the creature, and they would have disadvantage on attacks against you. This would even apply even if you have blindsight. Since blindsight doesn't actually remove the invisible condition, despite the fact that you can now see them, you still have disadvantage on attacks against them, and they still have advantage on attacks against you. This was insane to say the least, and actually has been resolved in the UA version of the invisible condition, which now includes a sentence in the attacks affected section, saying, if a creature can somehow see you, as with magic or blindsight, you don't gain this benefit against that creature. Secondly, before, you could not grapple or shove as part of an attack of opportunity. In 5e, grappling and shoving were only afforded to a player when taking the attack action, while the attack of opportunity is a reaction, and therefore those options don't technically apply. Not like it's that often that this was really causing problems, but it's still nice to see that it has been addressed. Now, grappling and shoving are baked into the rules for unarmed strikes. Attacks of opportunity are allowed to be made with unarmed strikes, and the new rules specifically state, whenever you use your unarmed strike, choose one of the following options for the effect. We are now getting really close to the publication of this next evolution of Dungeons & Dragons, and since all we have really seen are the classes and subclasses, there is still so much left that we have no idea what to expect from the team. I sincerely hope that they are taking the necessary time to look into rules interactions like these and address them for the upcoming publication. Let me know which rules you would love to see updated for One D&D in the comments below, subscribe to help me reach my goal of 5,000 subs by the end of the year, but otherwise, take care.